Welcome to what is one of my many favorite parts of language teaching and learning, and that is pronunciation and listening. Now, as teachers, we always have a little concern about our own pronunciation. Sometimes we don't need to be concerned at all about that, but we're also concerned about our learners' pronunciation. And today we want to look at what we can do to improve that. So first, we'll have a little look at context as humans. So humans have been listening for a very, very long time. We have had ears forever. Ears forever. We've never been human without ears. In fact, our primate ancestors always had ears. Ears have been a vital part of how we deal with sound, and without ears, we could never have developed speaking. So, when did we evolve speaking? So remember, we didn't learn speaking, we evolved it. There was a change in our DNA somewhere around here, which meant that suddenly, and of course in here, suddenly we had an ability to speak. And then we did wonderful things after that. But at that point, how long ago was that? It was, yes, you've got the answer, around about 250,000 years ago. Some people say longer, some people say shorter, but round about that time, we changed in an evolutionary sense so that we could speak. Now remember that that was an evolutionary change. Something happened in our bodies, in our DNA, which meant we could speak. The reason we could do it was, in the first instance, we could listen. And then after that, we had a change in our DNA, which meant that we could speak. Now, I want to ask another little question because it's useful for us to know this, and useful for us to remember that when it comes to writing, we did not evolve that. We learned that. At various points and in various places in the world, we started writing. And we started writing more or less 5,500 years ago. That writing was not the thing that created speech. Yeah? Writing is not the technique or the method for teaching pronunciation. It's not the method or technique for acquiring language. It's a support, but the real way you acquire good pronunciation and good speaking is through your ears. What can you do with those ears? You can use them as widely as possible. So see if you can make sure that you listen to lots of different accent types. And remember that of the 190 something countries in the world, in each of those countries there is someone speaking English, and they will all have different accents. And those accents are all perfectly good. So you want to listen to all of those, so number one, you can understand them, but number two, so your accent internationalizes. It's fascinating for me in Hong Kong, and I have always thought that I could listen to people and tell where they were from. And I thought I was quite good at it, but now it's almost impossible. I meet people in Hong Kong, I listen to them talk, and all I know is they're from somewhere in the world. They have developed an international accent, especially young folk. So remember that now and into your future, accent is not American English, it's not English English, it's an international sound. So get your models to be as wide as possible. Now remember, when you're listening to those models, obviously there are clever things you will do, but concentrate on meaning when you're listening. Brains really like meaning. So listen and as much as possible try and identify the meaning. Now if you listen to something and you like it and it's interesting, listen to it again and again, because when you listen to it again and again, your brain will approach each new listening differently. It will have understood or recognized words in the first listening, and then in the second listening, it will understand more. So it's really good for you to listen to something again and again and try really hard not to use those subtitles. When you're using subtitles, listening to things, you think, yes, I'm doing well, but you're not. You're not actually training your ears, you're training your eyes. And what you want to do, if you want to improve your pronunciation, if you want to improve your listening, is listen. Now, I know you've got that point, but let me make it once more, that if you want to develop good pronunciation, the key is good listening, because in that good listening, your brain is getting good models. Okay, so you will listen for meaning, and that's very important. You can listen and summarize, so you're paying attention to the main idea or the key ideas, and that's very, very, very good in terms of a listening skill. And we do that all the time as humans. We listen for meaning. But remember that if we're learning a language, that the meaning that we make is based on what we hear. Now, if we're not hearing it all, then the meaning that we make may be a little bit strange. So the other thing that you need to do is listen and repeat what you hear. Listen and repeat it again. Did you hear it all? Is there part of it that you have missed? So listen and check. Sometimes you can do this with a listening and a transcript. And just note for yourself which parts of it you have missed out on. So other key thing is to get some feedback on what you're doing in terms of your listening and your pronunciation. So if you output, as in if you speak in real conversation with someone and you see them going like that, then you know it's not quite right. Or you might see just little changes in their expression which tell you there's something in your language that needs to have some work done. So that's another really important thing, is that when you're listening and speaking, make it real as much as you can. So the idea of summarizing when you're listening is a really good one. Sometimes it's good to support that with precise questions. And these are really good in terms of not only focusing our attention on what we're listening to, but also training our minds and the minds of our students for the exposure to listening that they might have in a more academic context in the future. So really the kinds of questions that we've got here, which are all the WH questions, they are good in terms of helping us focus because we all know what they are. So you can start with who, for example. So you might say about this, who is being talked about, or who is the subject. And I think here the subject is humans and speaking and listening. And of course, its relevance for teachers. And what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the relationship between listening and pronunciation. And of course, you can go through all of these. Really nice way of focusing your mind on what it is that you're trying to listen to and summarize. So these sites are very good as a resource for improving your listening and therefore your pronunciation. And they're particularly good because they've got a wide range of resources, and you know that if you want to listen to something, it's much better if it's interesting. So you look in this at these sites and choose areas that are interesting for you. So that's number one, choose something that's interesting. Number two, make sure it's not hard. We know that if we want to see a benefit in extensive listening, then it should really be interesting and relatively easy. So don't be tempted to make it difficult for yourself. Make it relatively easy stuff, because if it is relatively easy, then you can do it a lot, and the combined effect of those three things will mean that you will listen more and get benefit more. So great sites for going in, also great for your students going in, looking at these and selecting things. Both of them have a range of different levels and a range of topics, so great opportunity for focusing on developing those listening skills. This is another really good technique for improving your pronunciation, your overall fluency, perhaps your grammatical accuracy, but a whole number of things that are all about you. Now, it's kind of easy to go to the mirror and look at your hair and go, aha, I know what I need to do with that. But it's sometimes perhaps a bit more difficult. Maybe we're a little bit more reluctant to go to the sound of our voices and say to ourselves, oh, I know what to do with that. So what we're looking at here is recording your voice as you speak naturally. So if you can, find a friend, I'm sure you have them, and say to them, just ask me some ordinary everyday questions. When they are asking you those questions, you record it. Yeah. What you're interested in is at the end, listening to the recording of your voice. What you do first is you listen to the recording of your voice and transcribe. So write down every single thing you have said, including and ah and strange little words or repetitions. So write them all down so you know exactly what it was that you said. Yeah. When you've done that, think carefully about it. Is it good? Is it clear? Is it accurate? If it's not, change it. Listen then intensely for the sound of the voice. How natural does it sound? How international does it sound? Do you have good parts in which your voice is fast and parts in which your voice is slow? Do you have lots and lots of long phrases or just a few little ones? How does it sound? So listen to that, be honest in your assessment of yourself, make some notes, and then record again the corrected version. Yeah, so you've written it out, you've thought about it, you've made your some notes for yourself, then record your voice again and listen to it. Is it better? Very probably better. If you think you've got it better, try and re-record it again. And then when you've got a much better model of your voice, listen to that. So your brain is being trained that you can speak differently. So really nice personal way of focusing on your particular challenges in terms of how you speak and particularly how you pronounce words. Write down what you think I've said, and then we'll look at what I have said. And in that, maybe we can learn something about the words that you heard or didn't hear. Are you ready? My dog is really clever and likes to steal things from the neighbors. How was that? Yeah? I'll give you a moment to write it down. Actually, you can just pause the video and let me go on to the next part. There we go. My dog is really clever and likes to steal things from the neighbors. So my experience of this particular piece of language is that when I've used this in the past at training events, most of the time people get it wrong. And when I say they get it wrong, they miss words, or they change words, or they produce odd things in the grammar. Now, what we're learning from that is that when we listen, as I've mentioned earlier, we tend to listen to overall meaning, and we base that meaning based on the words that we can decode. So we hear some of them and then we go, oh, I know what that means. Transcription or dictation used to be a regular part of classroom practice, and it isn't anymore, which is a real shame, because if you as a teacher can include tasks like this in your class, then you will develop your learners' awareness of what it is that they're not hearing. One of the really cool ways of getting a good model is to be one. So if you are teaching very young learners, or older learners, everyone enjoys a good story. Everyone. When you're telling that story, do what good storytellers do, which is exaggerate. And let me give you an example. So, once upon a time, many years ago, there was a young boy called Tom. Now, Tom was a very naughty boy. His mother would be so angry with him because he would never listen. And when he woke in the morning, his mother would say to him, Tom, can I ask you to clean your room? And Tom would say, yes, ma'am. But would he clean the room? No, never. And the mother one day said to Tom, Tom, you have a big problem. You only listen with one ear, and I never know which ear it is. And Tom said, but Mum, I do try. Okay, that's the end of the story for the moment. But within that sort of story, what you're doing is modeling intonation patterns, changes in speed, changes in pitch, changes in voice, and all of those convey the sort of meaning that you get in language when it is used expressively. The best way to fix pronunciation challenges is to not have them in the first place. And so a lot of exposure, which we've mentioned earlier, will go a long way to addressing the potential for pronunciation challenges to develop. But let's assume that they do. And when we have pronunciation challenges, which in fact I do, whenever I try to speak Guangdonghua, it's laughable. No one understands what I say. But in terms of our learners, we have to try and find ways where if they do have pronunciation problems, we can fix them. So let's just reiterate some of the important points we've made so far. You won't learn something by hearing it once. You need to hear it a lot. You need to listen extensively. You won't learn something by saying it once. There's a certain amount of mechanical practice that's necessary when you're producing a new sound. So do it again and again if you can. When you're doing a drill, and we've mentioned drilling earlier, when you're doing that drilling, also make sure that your learners are paying attention to the intonation pattern. So maybe they're moving their arms to address that, and you raise your hand when you want the intonation to rise, and drop it when you want it to fall. So pay attention to the sound in the drilling. Pay attention to how the words link, and make sure your students are copying that degree of accuracy in sound in the repetition. If you have any particular problem, so imagine you've got a student and you say comfortable and your student says comfortable, and you say comfortable and your student says comfortable, and they can't get it, which is normal. What you do is you back chain. So you start with the end of the word and you say table, Or you could start with bull. You can say bull, the student says bull. Then you say bull, and the student says bull. And then you say comfortable, and the student says comfortable, with luck. It may require repetition of that to work, but in back chaining, you start at the end of the word and work back to the beginning, and it has a little mental trick which allows the student to code it differently. Another thing that you can do, which I'm probably sure you do, is minimal pairs. So you put words together that are potentially confusable. So maybe bit and pit, but you put them together and practice those. So bit, pit, pit, pit. You might put bit and pit on the board, say one, and the students have to identify what you have said, or they can do that sort of practice and checking with their partners. Another really good extension of this is a technique called phonology-based listening. We're not going to go into that too much now. We'll go into that in greater detail in the listening input, but essentially in phonology-based listening, you're listening to a text and then doing a good job of decoding it and analyzing and repeating parts of it. Sometimes we need a little bit of help. And when I say we need a little bit of help, sometimes we need a little bit of extra assistance for the ears. So when our ears are not accustomed or tuned to hearing something, sometimes we need a little bit of extra support. So as the teacher on your whiteboard, after your learners have listened, after they have listened a lot and tried to produce, and if that hasn't worked, and only if that hasn't worked, then you can do things like introduce stress marking. So if you're looking at a word and it's got stress on one syllable, well then you can mark that with a little box or a circle or change in color or anything you want to, just to help with the process of recognizing stress. So that's a good simple one. There's another alternative which I kind of prefer because it's auditory and kinesthetic. So what you might do, and let's go back to that word comfortable, is you might look at a word like comfortable and go, how can I raise my students' awareness of the sound pattern in that? How can I raise their awareness of where the stress is? So for comfortable, we can do something like comfortable, where we get our students to sit up or sit down on the stress syllable. Yeah, so that's one example. Another example is just simply tapping. So comfortable, comfortable. And another one, which is equally good, and students can do it with one another, is clapping. So comfortable, comfortable. Now notice that in that the stressed syllable is much stronger. So this one is wrong, yeah? Wrong. This one's right. Yeah, so we have a stressed syllable and then an unstressed syllable. There's lots of other ways you can play with that sound. You could hum it. You could sing it if you wanted. Or there are many, many different ways that you could emphasize that sound just so you're helping with the recognition of stress. And on that point, the point of what stress is, I'm assuming that we're aware that when we talk about stress on a syllable, we're talking about that sound being longer or louder or having some pitch change. So for example, on comfortable, that initial syllable is longer and slightly louder. But in many other examples of stress, we will get a pitch change on a word. So for example, he is very intelligent. Yeah, we can see there's a slight change in pitch there. He's very intelligent. It doesn't have to be a change in pitch, but that is an indicator of stress on a word. So If you want to heighten or increase your students' awareness of word stress, well then doing things like either a drawing or a graphic to indicate where the stress is, or making sound and physically making sound is a great step towards that. One of the things that is really useful for us to know and for our students to know is that words have fixed stress patterns, so they don't change. So table is always stress on the first syllable and unstressed second syllable. So it's always table, it's never table or table. So a recognition that words have fixed stress patterns is interesting because what it does is it lets us recognize that they are important not only in speaking but in listening. So when we're listening to someone and we hear those stresses, well then we know more or less that it's very likely that that stress is the beginning of a content word or is a significant sound in a word. So our brains can recognize those stresses, especially in fast speech. And by recognizing those stress points, we can decode rapid speech quite well. So important point that when it comes to looking at word stress, there is a reason for it. So lots of things you can do with that, which are quite exciting, which is you can, clap out a stress pattern and get someone else to say what it is. You could do that with, for example, and okay, you wouldn't know because the words aren't there. But if there were words there, you could see that one of those words has 3 syllables and one of them is stressed. And it's the second one, yeah? And then the word is, of course, banana. Banana. And yeah, nice simple method for emphasizing the importance of stress in rapid speech. But there are other important things to do with stress, and that is how we can go about matching sounds. So we can match the full vowel sound of a word with what we see in our IPA, but almost as importantly, is to match the sounds to the unstressed syllables. And if we can look at a word and recognize that one syllable is stressed and the other is unstressed, and it's probably a schwa, that helps with our pronunciation and helps with our recognition of words. On a number of occasions on this course, you will hear us talk about drilling. And the logic for drilling is very, very strong. That in that patterned repetition with substitution, we're developing not only a memory of the sound, but we're also getting practice in terms of what we do with our lips, our tongue, and our jaw. So that mechanical practice is significant in terms of developing good pronunciation. So the teacher who does a good drill will not just be drilling the form. The teacher will be thinking about intonation patterns, the teacher will be thinking about stress, and the teacher will be thinking about how the words link together. So when you get opportunities for language, remember that it is much better to drill chunks of language than it is to drill single words. And when you drill those, try and get emphasis, try and get the right stress on the key word in an utterance or a sentence, and try and make sure that the syllables that are stressed are reasonably clear. Also, bear in mind that a good drilling system will also have good arm movement, and in that good arm movement you'll see a clear description of the intonation pattern. So lots of really useful things you can do with drilling. So it's always good to know what the data is or what the information is out there about word speed. Now, word speed is not something that we're all desperately trying to get faster at, but it is good to be aware that when we're speaking to our learners, we are probably going to be speaking quite slowly because we want to be clear. But at the same time, it's really good to speak quickly to demonstrate what language can really sound like. So if you listen to, say, the BBC, the word speed there is 180 words per minute, and that's designed to be reasonably efficient but not too fast. So depending on the kind of conversation you're having, you can have a word speed of maybe 150 words a minute, but if you're talking very fluently with a good friend who you have similar conversations with on a daily basis, well, then your word speed can be much faster than that. So just bear that in mind. It might be good sometimes to listen to a recording of your own voice or get your students to listen to a recording of their voices and try and recognize what their word speed is like. It's also really good to know that when we, as we have, talk about stressed syllables and unstressed syllables, the unstressed syllables are much faster. Yeah, they come out at roughly half the rate of a stressed syllable. So you look at, going back to the word we've been using, comfortable. If you took comf, and then tibble, you would see that comf is much longer than t and much longer than b. So good to know that word speed is not just about the number of words, but the number of phonemes you say in a particular period of time. If you try and make them all the same length, well, then you will never really sound like you're speaking an international version of English. Another thing that we probably want to be aware of is that when we build our listening skills and our pronunciation skills, we get involved in what is quite rapid speech. Now, when an average, and it varies from culture to culture and language to language, but when two relatively fluent speakers are speaking to one another in English, then the gap between the question and the answer is half a second. It's not 1 second, it's not 2 seconds, it's half a second. And frequently, if you listen, and you will find this in Chinese as well, that when very good friends are talking to one another, one of them may in fact start replying before the other person has finished. And you can only do that if you're very confident in your pronunciation, if you're very confident in your listening skills. This is a really cool task for checking and building skills in pronunciation, because in order to do this one well, you need to have good awareness of word stress, linking, and rhythm in language. And if you can do that, then you're moving in a really, really nice direction for developing good pron skills. We've mentioned earlier that voice speed is variable, and that really the more fluent you are, the more quickly you speak. Well, I'm not suggesting that you have to speak really, really quickly, but this is a really good challenge for you and for your students. Perhaps you will get a class speed speaking champion, but something that you can go through and practice just so that you get more fluency in those speaking skills. So I'll say it now just to give you an indication, but my indication is not perfect. It's just something that is an example of what language can sound like if it's spoken with good linking, with good stress, with good rhythm, and so on. So let me start. This is the house that Jack built. This is the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the cat that killed the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the dog that worried the cat that killed the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the cow that tossed the dog that worried the cat that killed the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. So there we go. You can do one of those yourself, time yourself, and see what your word speed is. I know that one of my colleagues produced this at, I think, 15.6 seconds, which meant that she was speaking at around about 400 words per minute, which is a pretty amazing rate, but a fun exercise to improve pronunciation in English. So let me start with what is a tricky question, and then I'll tell you why it's tricky. So if I said to you now, if you have a look at these 9 words, can you tell me 2 things? 1, how many syllables are in each word, and 2, which syllable is stressed? Now, you're probably going to go, oh my giddy aunt, how do I know? And there's lots of ways you can know, but of course the main way you can know is because you've heard them before. It's as simple as that. So what we have talked about earlier in terms of extensive listening is vital to help you identify where the stress is in a particular word. So that's the tricky question, is how many syllables and which syllable is stressed. But now the honest answer is that if I ask a native speaker of English, a lot of them won't know. Yeah, and there will be differences of opinion on how many syllables there are. But that's not terribly important. For us, what we really want to do is recognize that there are stressed parts of these words. So I'll say them for you now, just to see if I can help with that process. And then we'll go to another slide and look at what the answers are. So the first one, intelligence. Next, unambiguous. Next, phonetically. Next, recording. Next, brilliant. Next, possibility. Next, monkey. Next, disabled. Next, content. Okay. Shall I give you a little moment to guess that? Of course, you can just pause the video and then we'll go to what is the answer. So here is your opportunity to see how your answers went. If you haven't got it, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. What we're doing here is trying to raise our awareness that if our pronunciation is good and clear, and if our pronunciation is good and clear, well, then it's very likely our listening skills will be much better. So if our pronunciation is good and clear, and we pronounce a word like intelligence correctly, intelligence, well then someone who's listening will decode that quite quickly. They will have no problem in recognizing the sound. But if, for example, I said intelligence, someone listening to me might think I'm talking about ladies and gents, not ladies and gents, but gents. So intelligence. It's very easy for me to make a mistake when I hear that word because I think it's another word. So if we get the stress part of the word right, it's easier for someone who's listening to us to decode what we're saying. So I won't go through all of these just now. I will mention that, for example, brilliant is an example of a word on which people disagree about how many syllables there are. Some people will say brilliant, which is 3. Other people will say brilliant, which is 2. So it's a moot point. But What we want to do is recognize that there is a pattern in these words, and that pattern really helps with our understanding or our rapid decoding of it. Let me give you one example here of the effect of word stress. So let's take the word monkey. And when we hear monkey, we know that that first syllable is kind of big and round and strong. The second syllable is quite weak. If we turned it round, if we unstressed the first syllable and stressed the second, well then the word itself becomes really hard to understand. So if I said monkey, you would have no idea what I was talking about. So point to take out from this is for us and our learners that good pronunciation will lead to good listening skills. It might be good at this point to take a little trip back to what we looked at earlier on acquisition and language learning. And one of the key points that we took from that was that language learning is not about words. Language learning is about phrases. Language learning is about expressions. And that has a very big impact on how we teach sound. It is very tempting for us as teachers to teach individual words, to pronounce them with a great deal of clarity, but really that's not what words sound like. It's not what we really want them to sound like when we're speaking international English, and it's not what we really want to sound like if we want other people to understand us easily. So let's just look at what words really sound like when they join. Yeah, so we could have two words, next please, and that's perfectly good. Yeah, and if I said next please, there's a certain situation in which that is normal and acceptable. But in most situations, it's not. That level of emphasis is a bit strange, when in fact what we normally do is we join those words together. Now, when you look at This Is the House That Jack Built, you will see that almost all of those words are joined together. And in that joining, we get rhythm, we get lovely little linking, we get intonation patterns, we get the natural melody of English. We achieve that by letting the words join together. So instead of next, please, we've got next, please. There are lots of little rules for why we do this and how that happens, and they're interesting when you look at phonology generally. For us as teachers and for our learners, what we want them to do is just store those groups of sounds as almost one sound. Yeah, so when they've got them in their heads, they're not thinking next please, they're thinking next please. So let's try another one, another wheeler one to look at here, and that is I don't know. Of course, you can say I don't know, but that's very emphatic. Yeah. It sounds like you're making a very special point. Normally we say what you know and I know already, which is I don't know. Yeah, and that's a normal internationalized approach to speaking language. Let's take a look at another one. Post the letter. We never say it, yeah. We say post the letter. And what we're doing with the end of one of those words is that we're chopping off a little bit, adding it onto the next word, so we've got nice melody and rhythm in the language. So post the letter, not post the letter, but post the letter. We can take a look at some very ordinary words, and sometimes you will hear a teacher say older man. Yeah, separating the words, not recognizing that when you put those words together, things happen at the end of one word before it joins the next, which make the sound more fluent and more fluid. So old man becomes old man. Yeah, we lose that d, and the l becomes nicely wedded into the So we've looked at quite a lot in this input on pronunciation, and one of the key things that we've taken from what we've learned today is that if you want good pronunciation, you need good listening skills, because in those good listening skills, you are getting good models, you're training your brain to think and behave in a particular way. So in those listening skills, you want to be listening for gist. You also want to take a number of opportunities to decode, to see if you can identify all the words, and that's really important. Always with listening, you want to try and give close attention to meaning, and then get that meaning to work as much as you can with sound. We've had a look at a number of different techniques you can use to heighten your learners' awareness of sound and pronunciation, and we've also looked at how pronunciation, word stress and other things are very significant in terms of understanding what you hear and being understood.